Just a little note before I start. Well, the abstract I sent in for this talk was quite general, as abstracts often are. I have chosen, instead of doing a general overview of where I'm at, to focus on one particular example that I will be using for my thesis. There's also the slightly different title on this slide, because I feel like this one exemplifies what I am proposing to do and explicitates several of the points I will try to articulate. It's actually the first bit of my research I have been writing up. I'm now about 3 months into my 3rd year, and it's all starting to coalesce into something that will hopefully be coherent. And this also means that this is all work in progress, so I do welcome any feedback, suggestions, comments, pointings out of gaps in my reading and conceptual work, anything. It's all open and in the making. So maybe just before I start, some general context on my PhD research. So my PhD is situated broadly in what we could call environmental philosophy, or maybe a very specific subfield of what has now started being called philosophical ethology. And it focuses on conservation biology as a site of experimental practices of interspecies relationships, and more specifically on the ex-situ conservation of endangered wild species across kingdoms. Ex-situ conservation, which literally translates to conservation out of place, has been defined, among others, as, I quote, the conservation of components of biological diversity outside the natural habitat. This specific definition is from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit. So this includes living collections in zoological gardens and botanic gardens, as well as collections of suspended and frozen material in liquid nitrogen, in the case of animal tissue and gametes, and in freezers at -5 to -20 degrees, in the case of seed banks, or as you can see on this picture, on agar plates kept in a perpetual state of half-grown plants, in the case of recalcitrant seeds that can't be dried. This is at the Australian Plant Bank, where I did some fieldwork recently. And these two forms of ex-situ conservation often coexist in the same institutions. So zoos keep banks of frozen animal material, and botanic gardens often keep seed banks of the plants they grow. So my general aim is to understand what makes ex-situ conservation unique as a site of biopolitical significance, and to propose a genealogical investigation of the practices it is composed of and the discursive formations it makes possible, and how it contributes to the production of potential future natures. It's a field that has undergone fairly recent changes, both in techniques and in significance, most notably with the recent development of cryopreservation, which has updated the centuries-old practices of the zoo and the garden and grafted onto those. And it is a scientific field that is in the process of cohering, and therefore marked by very lively interdisciplinary debates about the possible uses and outcomes of this particular form of conservation, making it a very interesting site to be studying right now. So this paper, as I've said, will focus on one very specific practice, which is that of assisted migration. I'll explain it in more detail later. And this practice is one of the potential projected uses ex-situ conservation can be put to, that I have been looking at as an interesting case study. I will look at others, notably projects for assisted evolution in the case of cryopreserved corals, and also the collection of wild crop relatives, etc. And this provides an illustration of some of the points I want to make about ex-situ conservation as a lively and an experimental space. You'll also notice, as I've said before, I will be talking more about plants than about animals in this paper, although my research, again, spans kingdoms. And this is because, while the general scientific articles that have formed the conceptual basis for this particular debate present very general frameworks for the assisted migration of endangered species, they just happen to have circulated more widely and with greater liveliness in proposals that have been put forth by botanists, many of whom are actually working in botanic gardens, as opposed to other research institutions. And these botanic gardens happen to be at the forefront of experiments in assisted migration at the moment, so that's why I'm focusing on this. And this might be due to the fact that plants are structurally better model organisms for this kind of project, since they have already experienced a form of passive range extension through their current cultivation in botanic gardens around the world, and that the available material and horticultural knowledge provided by botanic gardens is combined with the relative ease of propagating and caring for plants, making these experiments less costly, both conceptually and materially. So I will talk briefly about the historical genealogy of ex-situ conservation before moving on to a more detailed description of proposals for assisted migration. And I will then try to unpack how these illuminate the genealogies of ex-situ conservation and why studying the latter obliquely through the speculative projects it supports is methodologically interesting. So what Q is about is putting the right species back in the right place. These words, pronounced in a rousing fundraising clip for the Breathing Planet campaign by Bruce Pavlik, who is the head of restoration ecology at the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, make the ex-situ conservation of endangered wild species sound like a very simple game of delayed jigsaw, and denote the solid trust in a biological status quo that is the bread and butter of public discourse for ex-situ institutions. There is no technological reason why any plant species should become extinct, the video goes on. This apparent trust in techno-fixes often goes hand in hand with an insistence on post-apocalyptic salvation and eternity in this type of public discourse. There is, for example, an article co-authored by Paul Smith, who is the head of seed conservation at the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, calling for, I quote, a botanic garden-centered global system that can prevent species extinction in perpetuity. As the anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose reminds us of cryotechnologies in general, I quote, they are end-time oriented, they move some matter into a zone of suspended life, enlarging the zone of the incomplete, in order to be able to kickstart time and life again when the moment arrives. The institutions which now carry a good part of the ex-situ burden, so zoos and botanic gardens, were born in a context of colonial expansion and have long served as trading houses and display cases of European imperial powers. The shift to actually fulfilling ex-situ conservation duties has happened relatively recently, starting in the 1970s and taking a decisive turn with the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, which I've already cited. And conservation in these institutions was first dominated by an emphasis on a salvific arc paradigm, which is a focus on captive breeding with a view to reintroduction. And this has now mostly given way to what has been called an integrated approach. So ex-situ conservation as part of programs supporting in-situ conservation, including breeding and reintroduction, but with more of a focus on research, training, education, awareness campaigns, and other forms of support for in-situ projects, of which the banking of animal tissue and seeds is also a part. So Deborah Bird-Rose's assessment of what the cryoconservation of endangered species is can be said to be characteristic of the way ex-situ conservation in general has been framed up until now, both in intra and interdisciplinary debates. It is not a settled practice, it is quite fraught, it is very debated within conservation biology itself, which has been marked by an ongoing debate on the relative merits of ex-situ and in-situ conservation, which one should be funded, which one should be prioritized, etc. And in discussions, more specifically in humanities, around the bio, cryo, and necropolitics of suspensive ex-situ conservation, which have taken off in recent years as well in animal and plant studies, multi-species ethnography, environmental philosophy, and philosophical ethology. The trouble has often been couched in the terms of the impossibly removed speculations they embody. So for what future are these frozen species being preserved? In what post-apocalyptic landscape will they be called upon to rise again? What are the competences and the knowledge needed to reanimate the contents of these liquid nitrogen tanks and foil packets after the apocalypse? And what, of course, about the problem of cultural transmission and perpetuation within the species itself? So a lot of those discussions have happened at the moment when life is put into the freezer, and the aim of my thesis is to come in at the point at which it gets taken out again and mobilized in speculative or concrete projects and various uses. Because I do, in fact, contend that suspension is not the only mandate of ex-situ conservation. Gardens, which can be said to be originally developed as miniature representations of a harmonious political and cosmological order, can in fact prove to be extremely unruly and unraveling. And there is trouble in the seed bank as well when it acts as a kind of temporal weight in the zone of the incomplete, distorting linear narratives and projects. And the simplicity of, I quote again, putting the right species back in the right place, that deferred horizon of species and ecosystem resurrection, which ex-situ conservation seems to tend toward, is belied by the complex temporal entanglements that emerge when it is read through the many uses and projects it supports, enables, and is shaped by. Assisted migration being only one of them, and the one I'll be focusing on today. So for all the sterile suspension of the deep freezer, the apparently sterile suspension of it, stockpiling, saving, and remembering cannot quite help being relational and being enlisted in projects that provide a testing ground for specific forms of relation to extinction. And this is what I aim to unpack in my thesis, the liveliness of ex-situ conservation as a laboratorized experimental space for future work and for the production of different or differential natures, a sort of de-black boxing of it in a Blatterian or maybe Harawaian sense of the term. Since, as the historian of science, Joanna Radin reminds us in the text about medical cryopreservation, I quote, each new use of cryopreservation as well as each new fantasy mutates a horizon of expectation in which frozen materials will reveal new and previously concealed forms of value. So ex-situ conservation projects are not just suspensive, they are vital and animated for better and, I would say, often for worse. First, maybe let me go back a little bit and provide some historical commentary on the emergence of ex-situ conservation. Since many ex-situ initiatives, as we now know them, take root in the zoological and botanic gardens and museums that were created and consolidated in the 18th and 19th century during the colonial expansion of European empires. This is just one example among many, and a story that is, sorry for the slide, often repeated, just more for the sake of having actual pictures up there. Kew, for example, which is both a very prominent botanic garden and currently housing the biggest seed bank of endangered wild species in the world. Before becoming a national botanic garden in 1840, was originally a private exotic garden enriched by its successive owners, and most crucially under George III, with the aid of the naturalist Sir Joseph Banks, whose fame and fortune, as many Australians probably know, as a naturalist, is itself tightly interwoven with colonialist journeys, and notably Cook's voyages, etc. And who saw in Kew the possibility of founding, I quote, a great botanical exchange house for the empire, where plants could be collected, acclimatized, and studied for scientific and economic gain. So that's the second partnership. The momentum applied at that time to plants by colonial botany set them in flux both ways. So on the one hand, scientific expeditions and collaborations with local collectors had a mandate to collect and bring back as much of the newly discovered natural wealth of the colonies as possible. Introduction to the heart of the empire, in the case of Britain, for example, equally served aesthetic taste, scientific obsessions, and economic goals. But the colonies were not exempt from these imperialist terraforming ambitions either, since along with unintended invasions by introduced species, which still plague many of those places, again, Australians would know this, the 19th and 20th century also saw the creation of acclimatization societies in France and in Britain, among others, in order to introduce native useful species to colonies in North America, Africa, and Australia. And in a process, incidentally, to make these landscapes more similar to European ones. So collecting and storing in this particular matrix of military and cultural domination and of post-Enlightenment knowledge practices meant setting the whole natural world into flux. And plants and animals in this context came to be seen as supremely separable from the native ecosystems and from each other, malleable into commodities, transferable from native contexts of knowledge, culture, and religion into what the anthropologist Natasha Myers calls the griddable system of colonial science, which serves, I quote, those capitalist and colonial desires for knowledge forms that facilitate the management of land and bodies, unquote. So once they were forged in this dismembering pressure and the certainty-producing grid of acquisitive relationships to nature, the principles governing the ordering and management of wildlife in botanic gardens could then very easily tip over into the suspensive mandate we now know under the form of ex-situ conservation. So going from the productivist practices of plant collection to the safe storage and propagation of endangered wild species. Private botanical gardens, curiosity cabinets and menageries, private botanical collections, curiosity cabinets and menageries became botanic gardens, museums and zoos, allowing for an ever more finely granulated management of non-human life, death, and display, and providing a basis for what we now know as the banking of wild genetic resources. The development of storage at sub-zero temperatures, which has been steadily perfected since the 1970s, also adds to the regime of the garden and the zoo the possibility of stabilizing and of disjointing life materially and temporally. So, yes, as the sociologist and historian Hannah Landecker would have it, the freezer acted as a central mechanism both within individual laboratories and companies and within the biological research community more generally to standardize and stabilize living research objects that were by their nature in constant flux. In short, to be biological, alive, and cellular means at present to be suspendable, interruptible, storable, and freezable in parts. So the banking of frozen material can be said to have effects on several levels: informational, through the standardization of the material, temporal, through its synchronization, and spatial or material through its stabilization. Effects that certainly come to bear in individual bodies, but perhaps also on species as a whole. And this will be, again, one of the aims of this research. The combination of collection of the world and of the salvation of endangered species in these practices and institutions of ex-situ conservation, and in particular in its most suspensive forms, like the freezer, is not, as I said, the only or the last mandate of these institutions. Because in fact, in what might seem like a strange return of the acclimatizing and landscape molding ambitions of colonial botany, the recent years have seen the emergence in the scientific literature of a host of proposals for what has been called, among others, assisted migration, defined, for example, as the translocation of a species to favorable habitat beyond the native range to protect them from human-induced threats such as climate change. Also defined in another article and in a more nuanced language as the purposeful movement of species to facilitate or mimic natural range expansion as a direct management response to climate change, unquote. So the terminology of assisted migration is still shifting and proliferating, just as can be expected from any kind of warm research in the making in Latourian terms. So it's been variously called assisted colonization, assisted migration, managed relocation, and managed relocation and chaperoned relocation. And this purposeful relocation of species would ideally mitigate both the effects of habitat fragmentation by mimicking plant and animal dispersal along naturally occurring corridors, as well as those of climate change by helping species migrate faster to keep up with the natural, the shifts of the natural range in the coming years and decades. Most of these projects, as of now, are still highly speculative, so there hasn't been much actually put into practice. There is one notable exception, which is the Torreya Guardians project. It's citizen-led, it's actually illegal. It's taking plants across borders from the US into Canada. And that's basically the only one that's now underway. So most articles now, as you can see, offer recommendations, for example, for seed collecting or for future translocations, feasibility studies, ethical frameworks, terminological reviews and clarifications, theoretical contributions to the ongoing debates, or desiderata for future accessions in specific institutions. So this is all really highly speculative. And it's all engaged in this very dense tangle of rhetoric and citational practices, again described by Bruno Latour in his Science in Action. So the past years have just seen a flurry of articles responding to and contradicting each other, some of them engaged in direct dialogue through letters to the editor, responses, etc., and proposing, as I said, everything from unified ethical frameworks to methods for efficient seed sampling and examination of species invasiveness. So, why examine the question of assisted migration as a relevant topic to ex-situ conservation? This is actually a question that touches on what I'm proposing to do in my thesis as a whole. Again, I said I will be examining other such proposals for the mitigation of extinction. And the first reason for having chosen this particular one is a very simple observation, which is the fact that these proposals almost always take explicit root in ex-situ conservation institutions and make use of the pre-existing collections, of the breeding and testing grounds, and reserves of germplasm that are offered by botanic gardens and their seed banks. And a good number of the authors of these papers, for example, are themselves researchers and working in botanic gardens at the moment, which I contend is certainly no accident. Just for a few more examples, if I have time, I don't. There is, for example, the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University, which is mentioned in the last article in this list, is one of the places that's proposing the collection and cultivation of what they call marginally hardy taxa, so plants that will be better adapted to the climate in Massachusetts, as it will be in 2 or 3 decades. The Missouri Botanic Garden is extremely active on the assisted migration front, has drafted a white paper, several articles. There is a project in Finland called Co-Adapt, which has set up experimental plots for 3 potential candidates for assisted migration in botanic gardens in Finland, Norway, and Estonia, etc. So assisted migration projects are kind of poised at this junction of the garden and the seed bank. They rely on the expertise accumulated by botanic gardens and on their material collected in frozen suspension. And what's interesting is that they also, in turn, seem to be extending the managed spaces of the garden and of the bank back into a changing and damaged landscape. And in doing so, allow for perhaps an unfolding of the biopolitical and conceptual reworkings that are taking place in the garden and the bank. applying them to the landscape outside, perhaps the planet as a whole, and becoming representatives of what the suspension of endangered life might do for and to the rest of nature once it is scrutinized through the lens of what ex-situ conservation might make possible. And this leads me to the second point that interested me, which is that as a projected outcome of seed banking, these proposals for assisted migration occupy an interesting temporal niche in a way. Again, Joanna Radin and Emma Cowell, in their introduction to a collected volume called Cryopolitics, speak of the horizon of future salvation as something that is eternally deferred by the suspensive cryopolitics of sub-zero storage. But I think that speculating on the possibility of translocating endangered species brings this horizon forward, even just theoretically. And it suddenly shifts into a very near future rather than remaining in this messianic time of post-apocalyptic salvation. And so this is one of the sites where the future of ex-situ conservation takes shape, where scientists are testing out and rehearsing theories and hopes, and present one of the possible projections and extensions of these collections into living futures. And as such, they represent one unfolding of the potentialities of the seed bank and one entry into these fraught and teeming livelinesses of suspended conservation practices. Since if nature is something that becomes global through successful mobilizations of objects of concern in the transformative milieu of the laboratory, and if the garden and the seed bank are becoming themselves a laboratory or a testing ground for scientific experiments, then what is at stake here is the development of future natures, forged both in deep freeze of the seed bank and the highly controlled living collections of the botanic garden. This leads me to the point that institutions for ex-situ conservation are, by the very suspensions they enact, interventions into worlds and nature. They inscribe specific assumptions about ecological catastrophe and in turn mold new worlds through the specific transformation life, generation, and nature undergo in managed captivity, which is why I'm calling them world-making devices. I'll try to be brief. Something that's been extensively studied already is the importance of institutions of captivity in shaping notions of the wild and of pristine nature, and in intervening in that binary. But I would argue that ex-situ conservation, as it is cohering now, might be participating in something that's slightly different than just this captive wild binary. And that rather than existing on this continuum, the politics and materialities of ex-situ conservation institutions, coupled with this sort of proposed uses, assisted migration, assisted evolution, etc., seem rather to exist on a gradient of managerial practices that do not necessarily presuppose an outside or a counterpart that's constructed as pure as untouched. So if managed captivity or suspension is becoming a sort of testing ground for future managed landscape, then what is learned from this sort of supervision might pave the way for a remaking of nature as something mobile that can be stitched back together by exerting a finely calibrated control. As one of the articles I've studied says, we envision a future where well-conceived translocations of species may reduce the risk of extinction, as well as increase the number of potential taxa, creating new assemblages in a fluid landscape, responding to broad-scale changes. And in this case, nature recombinant is something that can be had for movable parts in a moving landscape. And what's interesting, this is why I was talking about disciplinary genealogies, and this is why it is important to go back to the past of ex-situ conservation, the horticultural and agricultural past of it, is that the justification for this sort of plant translocation is in fact often located by these authors in the fact of the previous cultivation in botanic gardens. It is argued that they have already been moved in supposedly controlled settings, and that extending this practice to restoration ecology is not so much a break with natural processes as just an explicitation of what could be called acceptable horticultural practices. And this plating back together of disciplinary strands, which echoes what's going on in zoos, for example, as well, in terms of their inheritance of husbandry practices, is actually explicitly insisted on in several papers on assisted migration. There's this one as well, so translocating plants is nothing new. Humans have been moving plants, particularly edible, medicinal, and more recently ornamental species throughout our history. Modern horticultural and agricultural industries are responsible for wide-scale translocation. In addition, there is a tremendous wealth of knowledge resident in the restoration and horticultural communities in this regard, which needs to be formally documented so that it can inform decisions about assisted migration. So there is an interesting move back to this, what one could call disciplinary impurity, maybe, that is going on and being articulated very specifically in this particular debate. And in this case, conservation biology as a science of crisis, and agriculture and horticulture as practices of stability, be they geological, climatic, political, and social, might be seen as coming back together to inform a relationship to wild species that is being complicated by what is being learned in these techniques of domestication and the interventions they make possible. So I wonder, in this context, if nature is then in the process of maybe becoming a garden yet again, in a kind of doubling back to the zoological and horticultural interventions of the 18th and 19th century, and of course assuming that Western botany and zoology have ever left those behind. Probably not. And if so, the temporal and spatial dislocations that are operated by ex-situ conservation might help in speeding along this horticulturalization, allowing for an enclosure of nature, of the planet itself, through the extension of the managed capsule, that is the ex-situ repository, to what lies outside, and allowing for a landscape that can now be treated as an extension of the horticultural and agricultural inflections of the ex-situ regime. However, the wild so remade might be something slightly different or more than just a garden, since one more turning of the screw has been added to conservation biology recently by the eruption of techniques of visualization that have allowed for the emergence of the earth and of the environment as something that can be seen from the outside into collective consciousness and specific scientific practices. So I'm talking about the whole technological and military apparatus of the past decades that has allowed for aerial surveillance of the environment, things like the pictures of the Earth as seen from Apollo, etc., which have also fueled self-contained fantasies about spaceship Earth, that kind of thing. And these distantiating and globalizing visual sensing and control technologies have allowed for a construction of the wonder at the Earth as a pale blue dot, as the cradle of all life, as the environment as something that can be seen as a whole from the outside, and it is therefore to be cherished. But I argue that they might also have enabled a sort of contrary movement of what could be called an extraterrestrialization of the planet, of an Earth now made strange, alien, remote. We already have an abundance of terrestrial Mars analogues where we are rehearsing astrobiological and geological research into other planets. And I wonder if the interventions into ecosystems and landscapes that are allowed by this articulation of ex-situ conservation and projects such as assisted migration could be seen perhaps as a practice parallel to terraforming, this set of practices proposed specifically in the 80s for making other planets inhabitable. If they could be seen perhaps as a response to an unterraforming or a terra-deforming that has arguably been going on ever since the biggest human interventions into the climate and into composition of the planet. It seems to me that what is one of the things that is at stake here is that the distanciation that is performed by ex-situ conservation, by these suspensive practices, somehow makes it possible to look back at the planet and see it refracted as matter to be intervened into through the judicious application of life and of its adaptive power. And if in situ conservation can be said, as it has sometimes been argued, to be aiming for a Holocene museum, in which a good Anthropocene would just be a Holocene saved and suspended, ex-situ conservation might be doing something slightly different and stockpiling the components for a kind of future alien analog of what the Earth once was. This is not entirely thought of, but with a mandate to tinker for maximal inhabitability rather than exact reproduction. And that is, to me, the sense in which assisted migration projects, such as and other projected uses of ex-situ conservation, emerge as what one could call the science-fictional expression of the frozen arcs and the seed banks we have now. As a science fiction writer and theorist, Samuel Delany famously puts it, science fiction is not a representation of the future, but, I quote, a significant distortion of the present. A definition which might be, without doing it too much violence, be applied to speculative conservation projects such as this one. As I said, assisted migration outside natural ranges, it's still at the very early and prudent stages of implementation, and proposals for the future wider applications of that are science-fictional in Delany's sense of the word. They distort the present, a present in which vast quantities of the past have been stockpiled for uncertain planetary futures. And assisted migration is only one possible expression of this stock of biodiversity and of the world and the events, extinctions and environmental catastrophes that are inscribed in and constituted by that stock. And a significant distortion in that it chooses very specific elements to actualize or amplify, and out of which to world build new natures that represent only one possible planetary future. In this perspective, the persistence of the past in suspensive conservation does not necessarily, I think, lead only to fantasies of its stable and eternal recreation. And anticipating the future means activating uses of the past that go beyond single self-identity. And ex-situ conservation does not, in fact, try to loop back into Holocene stability, or not solely try to do that, but is constantly pushed into the presence, always shimmering between projection and existence of its futures, enacting them theoretically, testing what it might do with the species it has stockpiled. Just as a sort of conclusion, I would say that the present of ex-situ conservation, be it living or suspensive, so in gardens or in seed banks, a present which relies on the accumulated presence of an evolutionary and planetary past kept in reserve to anticipate uncertain futures, is worked through with a shimmering set of potentialities that must be studied in order to understand the full scope of suspensive practices and interventions into future worlds, which is what I'm proposing to do. fragmentation, control, extraterrestrialization, cataclysmic environmental catastrophe, climate change as warfare, Earth as a self-contained and recursive cybernetic entity, the reactivation of terraforming ambitions, all exist as possible world-making projects banked along with seeds and gametes. And assisted migration in a few years or decades' time might then stand as a sort of monument of a retro future, as one of the ecological futures that might have emerged from the capsular enclosure of ex-situ conservation, remaking nature as an extraterrestrialized space of transformation and horticultural and agricultural care. A technoscientific entity that could be placed squarely into Donna Haraway's litany of chimerical, I quote, objects into which lives and worlds are built: chip, gene, seed, fetus, database, bone, race, brain, ecosystem, unquote. The suspensive repository thus becomes a place where past, presents, and futures team alongside each other, for better or for worse, but certainly animating suspended bodies in their safe cryosleep with a wealth of potential temporal becomings, binding them back into complex networks of hope and mourning, material and discursive work, despair and technological fixes. Informing various forms of turmoil and temporal margins, ex-situ conservation is just as explosive, I would say, as it is suspensive. It is teeming with the manifold virtualities of the future, and could be said to be a reduced model in Lévi-Strauss's sense of the term, an active experiment on the object it represents, a sketch and a blueprint for various kinds of present and future natures. And whether it becomes a device for a humbly modified attention to species, relationships to extinction, and the management of disrupted landscapes and climates, or a proposal for queering two self-evident technoscientific linearities, or perhaps something much more violently normative, depends on which experiments can be grafted on the fraught and impure pasts these institutions have accumulated.